session is going to be about manure and cover crops. Hopefully we're going to give a few quick talks and then we'll move on to a panel discussion and get lots of your questions. They'll have a boxed microphone that will go around, so hopefully everyone can hear the questions. And then I'm in charge of doing some intros, and I guess I get the pleasure of introducing myself first. Dan Anderson, I'm from Iowa State University. I work in the Ag and Biosystems Engineering Department, and I pretend to be Dr. Manure at least most days. So I'm going to try and talk a little bit about manure, a little bit about cover crops, and then hand it over to the stars of the show so we can hear what they're really doing in practice. So I think we all know that livestock manure really is a benefit to this state. It's a great fertilizer resource, and despite what you might hear, only about 30% of the nutrients that we need to support our crop production can actually come from livestock manures. So we are a manure-poor state, right? We have plenty of capacity to utilize all our manure. And lately, a lot of the conversation has turned to what are some of the other benefits of manures, right? Things like micronutrients or improvements in soil health. And as we think about the soils in Iowa and wanting them to be a sponge for nutrients, be a sponge for water, increasing that carbon, increasing microbial activity is an important part of that, and manures certainly play a key role. Just a little bit on that from my standpoint, all manures have carbon in them. Some manures have more carbon than other, and if you are putting manure on your soil, you're certainly going to be increasing that organic matter content, right? That is the sponge, that's really what's holding water, and it also helps hold our manure application equipment up. That is a long-term process. I tried to do some estimates here of what it would take to increase your organic matter by 1%. Certainly the soil type matters for that, what your application strategy is, but this is a long-term plan, right? This is something that it's working at over the long haul, trying to get better every day and just doing a little bit better with what we're doing to build our soils and make sure they're still a resource for Iowa. I know this is a pork conference, but I have the soil health monitoring on some poultry manure. We've been putting poultry manure on some plots near Ames for about 20 years, and our results really showed that we were building that organic matter content. We had healthier soils. We had better structure to the soils. So that's not something that's just out there that we talk about. That's something that we have some scientific data to support. And if you're wondering what the last two particulate organic matter are, right, it's when our organic matter makes our soil clumpy enough to stick together, really having a good tilth, a good structure. I wanted to talk about cover crops, and we've been doing a cover crop experiment for about 4 years now. It's up in Nashua, Iowa, so up in the northeast corner. Not always the greatest growing conditions in the fall, right? We sometimes get our cover crops on a little bit late, or manure on a little bit late, given the weather. But there's a picture of what our growth looked like in the spring of April of 2016. And one thing that I really wanted to point out to you, and I think it shows up in the picture reasonably well, is you can see some striping in that field, right? Where one of those cover crop rows every so often looks a little bit better than the other ones. That's where we're right over the manure. So oftentimes you'll hear people talk about cover crops scavenging for residual nitrogen in the soil. In this case, that row of cover crop that's right over that manure band, it almost gets fertilized, right? So it takes up a little bit more. And we did some measurements on how much more it's actually taking up. And oftentimes when you hear cover crops, people will say it's taking up about 30 pounds of nitrogen per acre. When we had that manure band where we added some fertilizer, we really got it to take up closer to 60 or 70 pounds of nitrogen per acre on average, right? So more of that nitrogen is getting scavenged, held into that cover crop, and hopefully staying there for our next growing crop. One of the things we always get asked about is how do corn yields do? So far we have 3 years of data summarized. I don't have the 2019 yields summarized yet. I apologize for that. I should get caught up. The first thing is, when I look at these two, this is with and without a cover crop, right? So the blue line there is no cover crop, red line's with a cover crop. Other than that, those two rotations are the same. Corn, soybean, we're putting all our nitrogen on it in the fall, actually early fall, somewhere around the beginning of October, with swine manure 150 units, so right at sort of the ISU recommended rate. That first year we had a rough time, right? You can see that our cover crop soil yielded about 26 bushels less. When we had the planter set up that year, we got poor closing of our seeds that spring, right? So we didn't get good germination. The stand didn't look as good. The next 2 years, we took care of that problem, right? And we had 5 bushels more and then 16 bushels more the second year. And 2019 is going to show the same, right? From what I saw so far, the data that I don't have summarized, our yields were improved again. So that was something where there was a management struggle getting used to that cover crop in our rotation. But once we sort of figured out how to manage for it, things got better pretty quickly. The other thing I wanted to point out is manure application timing is pretty important to us, right? So I have here an early application compared to a late application. So that'd be October 1st roughly compared to November 1st. By delaying that application to a month, we saw huge yield increases. One of the parts that's unique about this study is we can really look at water quality data as well. And when we had that cover crop in there, we saw somewhere around a 30 to 40% reduction in the amount of nitrogen making it down to the tile lines. So it's not just that the nitrogen that the cover crop has some vigorous growth, that it's holding on to that nitrogen. It really is helping keep it out of the tile lines and hopefully keeping it available for our next growing crops. one of the questions I get asked a lot is, how do I work this into my system? Should I be putting my cover crop on and then planting manure? Should I fly a cover crop on and then trying to apply manure to it? So one of the things we tried to do is just a lab soil incubation to see how different timings might impact that. There you can see my soil column, just fancy 6-inch PVC pieces of pipe, get some rye growing in them, and then we put manure on at various times. We were aiming for somewhere around a 75 pound per acre cover crop planting. We used strictly cereal rye, and then we put manure on at somewhere around 150 units of nitrogen per acre. Came back, leached them periodically to see how they did at holding nitrogen in that soil. Just like we saw in the field, if we put that cover crop on, we got somewhere around a 25 to 30% reduction in the amount of nitrogen we lost compared to if we didn't have a cover crop on. So that was nice to see. Then the second part of that question that we were really trying to focus on was what does the timing of that mean, right? So if I put manure on and then put my cover crop on, if I wait a couple weeks and get it started, or if I have a nice month of growth, which one is going to hold more nitrogen? And really what we saw is the more that cover crop was growing, the better job we did holding on to that nitrogen, right? So if you can fly it on and then inject into it, you probably are going to get more of that nitrogen incorporated into your cover crop. That was really nice for us to see. This is just another way of looking at that data. It really was correlated. How much nitrogen we were losing was correlated to how much growth we had, right? The more growth we had, the more active that cover crop growth, the less nitrogen we actually had make it down to the bottom. They told me to stay at 10 minutes, so I achieved my goal. So first we're going to have Steve Berger come up. In 1997, after nearly 20 years of continuous no-till, reducing soil disturbance and erosion, Steve began raising swine to diversify their grain farm and utilize the manure as a source of nutrients. A few years later, Iowa law began requiring certain confinement feeding operations to develop and obtain DNR approval of manure management plans to apply manure. At the time, Washington County was the leading in the state in no-till crop production acres and swine production. As MMPs were implemented, highly erodible soils were being tilled again to meet the state MMP requirement to incorporate swine manure. Steve will talk about their management approach to apply swine manure on their long-term no-till cover crop system to minimize the impact on soil organic matter, soil health, and water quality.
About 8 years ago, there was a farmer that received some awards for fertilizing manure on cereal rye in the spring, which was kind of different, you know, spring applied manure, applying, you know, surface application. And this was Jeff Fry out in Pennsylvania, and that was kind of the impetus for me to start looking more at surface applied manure. And there's just a lot of conflicting things when you talk about subjects, you know, carbon loss, volatilization, you know, spring application, fall application, you know, compaction. There's no silver bullets. And then when you get talking about manure, it gets even harder, you know. But, you know, when you leave here, this is what we're really trying to do. We're trying to drift closer to applying the manure, closer to when we grow that crop, the spring application, you know, onto rye surface applied. And we don't do that completely, but that's where we're trying to be, you know. And so I'll show you a lot of different things. This is a cereal rye field. It looks pretty typical in the spring after a 4-inch rain, you know, back in 2012. We started in the early 1970s. This was my very first no-till. Happened to be into cereal crop rye. We're still doing that today, maybe planting more into green, corn and soybeans both. I'm just kind of rushing through this so I can get through it in my 10 minutes too. But if this is one third-party picture I'd like to note here is a Bing map, and you can see on the upper half of the green rye, and then in the lower half you have the maybe about 3 different operations. If I look at the south screen, you see the erosion on no-till, and this, like I said, this is off of Bing maps, and we were seeing this in our no-till in the early days, and that's why we went to rye. You just notice there just isn't anything going on there with the cereal rye. You've got one management system here. Here's a second, here's a third one, and then you've got the cover crop rye. That's what we started to see, the erosion in our no-till, and then we started the rye. Another thing we noticed is the organic matter. This is a pretty typical organic matter percentages made up in the Southern Drift Plain that we're a part of. You know, we get a lot of that 2 to 3%, once in a while a little higher. This is a barnyard. If you look over here in the south, this is an old barnyard. It hadn't been there for 50 years. But if you look at that fence row, 6 to 7%, you know, that was what the native organic matter was, you know, and so we basically have lost half our organic matter, you know, just through tillage and soil oxidation. And so if you use a microscopic slide, you know, comparing a long-term no-till cover crop compared to a highly tilled field, You know, in the flat parts of our county, you can see the difference. It's basically your pore space is much more. We have more pore space, so when we apply the surface manure, we can get infiltration rates maybe much higher than if you were tilled soil. So what you're not seeing here is you're not seeing the pore space, you're not seeing the biological activity. Kathy Woida, the state geologist, was the one that took those pictures a few years ago, and that was kind of seeing and believing. Some of the conflicting things we have, you know, we know when we surface apply manure, we're going to get volatilization. You know, we get a question on that quite a bit, and so we know there's a loss there. What we try to do is spread later into November, December, when it's cold, right before freeze up. And again, our infiltration rates are higher. We think we're getting more in the ground. The CO2 going up. So anytime you till the soil, you know, you're going to oxidize carbon, you know, whether you're, you know, out in your garden hoeing it or plowing or anything. And so that's why we like to surface apply our manure, is so we don't, you know, we're not oxidizing the soil. And, you know, these are the things we kind of go back and forth. If you'd ask an average farmer going down the road, he said, why aren't you getting that worked in the ground? I said, well, we're maybe losing some to volatilization, but we're also not oxidizing that off. And if you remember that organic map where we're running about half of organic compared to our fence row, that's what you're doing all those years of tillage. You're oxidizing that carbon off. And so, you know, that's why we do what we do. We've also do some knife and manure into rye, some before the rye is planted, some after. This is some dribbled on top of some permafrost. And we've also used those kind of openers too. So we've done a little bit of everything. What this picture here is just showing is after about a 6-inch rain, we got a waterway full of water, which is pretty typical. But if you look at that center part, it's like chocolate milk. It's brown. It's got some soil in there. That is coming off the neighbor's farm at the top of the hill that had a vertical till machine run over it. Pretty good no-till farmer, but he vertical tilled it. And you're still seeing, anytime you touch that soil, you get movement, and that's what that's coming off of. And if you go above and look, I took that picture right there, and it was coming off of about a 42-acre piece coming down through there. And so you can just see what happens when you move soil, anything you do, whether it's with a corn planter, you know, row cleaners or anything. And so that was another thing that we tried to keep in mind. That was a really busy slide, but this is one way to maybe summarize what we do with our no-till cover crop operation as far as nitrogen. If we would look at the 1 o'clock position, this is the beginning of our crop year right after harvest, and as we go around through the whole crop year to when we plant in side dress. Oh, okay, so these are some of the activities that we're doing, and we're starting off with ammonium sulfate in the fall, maybe a little bit of turkey manure that we get. We're doing some fall swine manure. We go through the winter. We come back in the spring, maybe some ammonium sulfate on some farms. We're moving more to spring manure, doing some manure or doing some fertilizer activity at the planter with UAN, and then some sidrus. Now, we're not doing every one of those on every field every year, but those are kind of the activities when they take place. And one thing we're trying to do is move this nitrogen around more to when the crop needs it. Maybe move this fall manure more to spring manure. The ammonium sulfate, the sulfate is very, it can get away faster than nitrate. It can float away on you really quick, and so maybe we should move our ammonium sulfate more this direction. So but we're doing the ammonium sulfate trying to bring the carbon-nitrogen ratios in line. We're trying to add nitrogen for the microbes to eat more, and so we can bring that carbon-nitrogen rate down to when that corn starts to emerge in the spring, that we don't compete with the microbes. And that's why we do the ammonium sulfate. Corn, if you're in a 250 bushel crop, it's going to take 400 pounds of nitrogen, or an 80 bushel bean crop, 5 pounds a bushel. That's going to take about 400 pounds of nitrogen of uptake to raise that crop, or 1.6 pounds per bushel is a number. Some of that's going to come from the soil through mineralization, and some of it's going to come from commercial fertilizer. The real trick is, how much can we get that soil to mineralize? That's the real trick, but those are real numbers, and that's what it takes to grow that crop. And so we're trying to keep it from infiltrating away with the cereal rye. And so this is maybe not what we should be doing, but we're trying to slowly maybe change some of our management practices so we can get the nitrogen to when the crop needs it. And so we're starting to make some adaptations that way. I just put the bean picture up here just to remind folks that soybeans use a lot of nitrogen, and so it's really important that we keep that in our policy, you know, because if you start getting to 75, 80 bushels, you're going to need to add nitrogen to those beans somehow. Now, I don't mean blowing manure on necessarily, because we know that gives you a lot of vegetative growth. And so this is just a picture of our corn planter. It shows of all the attachments and stuff we put on today. They're getting, you know, highly technical, but what we found when we run that corn planter through the field on injected manure, maybe at an angle, it gets pretty rough and we don't get the best seed placement. And that's when one day we finally decided, told the guy to get the bar out of the ground and don't make it so rough. That's the one thing that really pushed us to do that. And so we've had our own manure bars from time to time. This is the Berger. A lot of moving parts, a lot of maintenance. You know, I'm sure you've seen those. We've tried that. Got a lot of rubber underneath of it, you know, to keep it light in the spring. That's what it looks like afterwards. So we have injected some manure. This is a picture of some nursery manure going on at about 7,000 gallons an acre, and we're drilling rye right behind it. So what we're trying to show is at 7,000 gallons an acre of nursery manure, and we're right behind there with that drill, not slopping it up too much. And so that really shows, you know, the infiltration rates. And ironically, one of the tile lines that we capture for water quality test gets about 3 to 5 parts per million all the time, you know. And so I thought you can't really see that. But this is really the key there, is showing the high infiltration rates that we've had through the no-till cover crops. We've injected manure, you know, through the years. That's just one picture of a corn-on-corn field. This is one of the more popular bars out there. Anytime you loosen that soil, it has the potential to leaving the farm. This is probably what we do the most of the day, is surface applied manure with a drag hose. We do that. This was back about 20 years ago where we were surface applying it. You can see the uptake in the fall with the cereal rye. We've injected manure, then planted rye afterwards. We've done it just the opposite. We find if we apply our manure in the spring, we don't get as much, you know, damage to the rye. And I'm just going to try to finish up here by going through and just show pictures of fields that have no-till cover crop compared to those that don't. And so, like, we see this picture here after a 4-inch rain in April about, well, this is back in 2012. Same field just down the road, same rain, but you see quite a difference, you know. That's if we can just get, you know, stop the tillage and get some rye growing, you know, we can stop that. A lot of D-slopes in my hills in southeast Iowa. That's typical of the southern drift plain. You get the erosion where you don't have the cereal rye there in the background. You've got some rye that's been sprayed, rye that hasn't been sprayed yet. And then on the tilled fields, you get the erosion. So as we kind of go back and forth comparing, I like to do that so you can kind of see the different systems. This is after a 6-inch rain. We didn't hold all the water. We filled the terraces up, but boy, there's not much washing going on. This is off the old Farm Progress Show site back in 1977, a really flat farm, but yet you look at the erosion coming off of those flat prairie areas. These are some D-slopes. We're getting a little bit of washing here after a 6-inch rain, but we really held it together pretty good. You know, it's a really stable system. The microbes and the mycorrhiza fungi and the glues from the rye and the roots hold that soil together. So we just kind of go back and forth, and you can kind of see the difference. This was back in 1988 off a field near Kyoto, Iowa. You know, this has been in rye cover crop, but yet on the prairie. This is a much flatter farm than what the telephoto lens would make it look, but you can just see the difference in how that rye holds that on the surface. Some D&E slopes here, but if you look here in a tilled field where they just did the anhydrous, you know, you got water ponding there. It's not going down, you know, and so that's where, I think the point is, you know, that's where the surface application, where we can maybe get away with it more after maybe a 4 or 5 year system. And we just kind of go back and forth. You see this, and you know what I'm talking about here. This is an organic farm, Amish farm, North of Kelowna. We take, after a 7-inch rain back in June, just takes it down to the plow pan, you know. just another big rain. I stood in one spot. This is an infiltration on a no-till field. I turn 180 degrees on a rye cover crop. The river's coming up down there. See the river already? I mean, so that's got the same rain. If you just compare the difference in the tillage versus the no tillage in the cover crop, that's really infiltration rate at its best, you know. And so when we're blowing that manure on the top, you know, we just lift those injectors up and let it come down in a stream. And I think we're getting quite a bit more in the ground, and maybe our volatilization loss in nitrogen may not be quite as bad as maybe what the book values are when you look up. And so that's kind of where we're headed to. We realize that the DNR regulations, you know, we have to comply with those, you know, work with the neighbors. You know, being in the no-till cover crop for a long time, you get a lot of goodwill too to begin with, and so we don't have much neighbor issues, you know, surface application, but I realize for those out there that may be very different for you too. It's a very personal thing and a regional thing, but we're able to get by with it. So that's kind of where we're migrating. I better stop here. I've used my time up. And if you have any questions, I'd be glad to take them afterwards. Would that be right? So.
All right, and then we're going to invite Mark Schleisman up. He lives on a diversified farm family operation near Lake City, Iowa. He farms with his son-in-law, and daughter. He is lucky to have his dad and 2 uncles continue to help on the farm when needed. Well, that's got to keep everyone busy. The Schleismans have a 660 head cattle feedlot, 400 cow-calf pairs, and they market 36,000 fat hogs from their wean-to-finish barns. They farm 4,500 acres of row crop, specializing in popcorn and popcorn seed production. So with that, please welcome Mark to the stage.
I don't have any slides. I'm just going to talk a bit about what we do. As he mentioned, we have a lot of hogs. We have some cattle also. With that, the manure covers about 1,400 to 1,600 acres a year from our hogs, and about 200 to 300 acres a year from our cattle yards. We like the manure a lot better than commercial fertilizer, but you have to manage it like commercial fertilizer. It's still subject to loss. Over time, we've changed the way we've done that. I mean, 10 years ago is way different than what we're doing today, and that's even way different than 20. I look at it as it's a piece of our nitrogen program, but it's not our total nitrogen program to use hog manure. Very roughly, when it comes to hog manure, it's maybe on those acres that we cover with manure, it's maybe 70%, 65, 70% of our nitrogen source for that crop. Part of the reason I do that is it's not as easy to apply it at side dress time or with the planter, but I don't want to use up all the nitrogen I need as a pre-plant manure application and then not have anything I can put on later, because that pre-plant application is still subject to the losses a commercial fertilizer is. I mean, there's some aspects of it that make it a little more stable because some's in organic form, but it still can denitrify, it can still volatilize, just like your commercial applications. So we've really gone to managing the manure as part of our overall nitrogen program. With that, we also keep in mind the P&K side of things. On fields that have historically had manure on, we're seeing our P&K levels get too high because we do a lot of corn on corn. As you mentioned, we do a lot of popcorn production, which actually removes less of that P&K than what normal corn does. Just because yields are lower with popcorn. It's about roughly half of what field corn is. So over the years, that 1,600 acres that gets covered with manure has changed. It's not the same 1,400 to 1,600 acres a year. It's, as you mentioned, we farm about 4,500 acres. We're covering about 80% of those acres get hog manure sometime in a 3-year period. Not every acre gets rotated every year, but most of them do. What's really helped us with the manure is cover crops, we believe, because it's tied up some of that nitrogen. It'll suck it up, as you've seen in the pictures. My fields look the same in the sense that you can see the strips out there that have more green to them because the cover crop has pulled that up in. And you've heard over time that a lot of growers don't like corn on corn in a cover crop situation or a cover crop in corn because they're seeing a yield reduction. A lot of that's because they're not managing the nitrogen. that cover crop is taking up nitrogen, so it's taking it away from your crop early, but it's going to supply that later when it starts to mineralize after you've killed it, gets to the soil. That nitrogen is going to release from that crop that starts decaying. So you can account for that. You might have to put some starter on or something to get it going through that phase because the cover crop maybe sucked up that nitrogen that was in the manure, but it's going to release it later on, and that can be a bump in yield or a piece of your kind of spoon feeding the crop its nitrogen. Almost everything we do is no-till. And the reason I say almost, if we do have to apply hog manure in the spring, which 9 years out of 10 we do not do, but there's always that situation that comes up that you might have to. Those are the only fields we might till, depending on conditions when it goes on, trying to plan into a manure applicator track or something like that. But almost everything is fall applied. 80% is probably corn on corn. But it's done with a no-till applicator where we just run a straight coulter, no covering disc. So some of it's being surface applied, but most of it's going down that coulter slice to get it into the ground. But going into a standing cornstalk field, most people don't know we've applied manure when we're done. I mean, you look at it, it maybe looks like you took a roller across the field because you've kind of run over the stalks and flattened things out, but all the stalks are on the surface. You don't pull up much dirt with the straight coulter, and the manure is just going in the ground, which makes it nice to plant back into the next spring. If it's wet applications, you might pull up a little bit of dirt with your coulters. And it was mentioned about the roughness of the planter. Well, what we've done is we've started to, all of our fields will actually run a lot of guys use it for soybeans, a roller to roll over, to flatten the soil out to make soybean harvest easier. We roll all of our corn ground going to corn because it flattens out the crowns of the old corn crop, but it also, if you did get any soil lumps that you pulled up, it flattens those out too, and it makes the planter run a lot smoother. So that's one way we've kind of managed some of that. When it comes to the cover crop side of things, we've really seen them help with the compaction. Everybody says, well, if you haul manure, you're going to have compaction from that cart. Well, over the years, by having that cover crop out there, our soil structure is so much better. It carries the applicator a lot better. But it also, because of those roots growing there, when you kill off that cover crop, plant your commercial crop, those roots create channels. The soil compaction it's like deep, well, it's deeper than deep tillage because your roots go farther than what your ripper's ever going to go. But we break up that compaction with a crop instead of breaking it up with tillage. And I use it's not a manure per se example, but on our farm we have a piece of ground that we thought we were abusing it every year. We've done rye on this field ever since my dad can remember because we always calved cows on it. But in the spring, that field the rye is eaten down to nothing because that's where we calve the cows. And you think it's hard as a rock because, the cows are out there packing it down. But after we take those cows off, the rye still starts to grow again. We spray the rye, and 2 weeks later, that soil is as mellow as any field from a looseness standpoint and a water infiltration as a field that we didn't do that on. And that's because those rye roots are there. You don't have to have a lot of top growth. Those cows have been eating it off, so it doesn't look green anymore, but the roots are still down there growing. That also became apparent to me this year. It's a tough, at least in our area, because we're north a little bit more, and we just didn't get any fall growth to speak of out of our cover crops at all. Really doesn't matter what species I seeded. Most of what we seed starts about mid-August in our popcorn fields and popcorn seed fields because we're getting a lot of sunlight to the ground in those crops. Our field corn goes in mid-September with an airplane, or we got a high cycle that goes over. I don't care how we did it this year, we just never got much fall growth. There just wasn't enough sunlight, there wasn't enough temperature. But the roots are still there, and that was apparent to me. Christmas time, we were out still being able to tile fields because we didn't have too much frost yet. But we were seeing white roots down about this far with no visible greenness on the surface. The rye was there. It was maybe an inch or two tall. But those roots were already a foot, 2 feet deep because you saw those white roots going through that soil profile. And it wasn't corn roots because the corn was been dead for months. It was from that rye that was out there. Now this spring, that field's going to green up. It's going to grow, and you'll think you had good fall growth, but that's rye. which is another thing. We use different, we really have a prescription of cover crops that we use depending on what we're going to do with it. You mentioned cows. We graze about 80% of our acres with something at some point in time throughout the year. Some of those fields get fall graze, some get spring graze, some get fall and spring graze. It just depends on logistically where they're at and what you have for fences and how far from home they are. But that's where we use different species also. It's not always just rye. We use oats if we know we're only going to fall graze it with some rye in with it. We'll use a pure rye stand if we know it's only going to be spring grazed, because you get a lot better growth out of oats in the fall if that's the only time you're going to graze it. But we still put the rye in there because we like what the roots do growing through the winter and into the spring, but we'll use a lower seeding rate because we got the oats. If you're going to do the manure application, you need to think about what species you're using too. Certain things can handle the traffic of that manure applicator. Oats and rye, pretty well. They have a good fibrous root system. You can cut through it and it's still going to grow. The only brassica I've found that does very well after manure application is going to be probably rape, and it's because it can handle more traffic. But if you run over a radish or you run over a turnip that's been established, it's dead. And you break that crown of that plant and it's not going to grow. So if I know I'm going to put on manure, I'm probably not going to have radishes or turnips out there. I'll probably have rape out there if I want a brassica in there. Something we found that, I mean, you just got to think ahead and make it, another thing, you got to plan for it as a crop. It's not just something you throw out there, the cover crop side of it. We treat our cover crop like a crop. I mean, I have a cropping plan for all the cover crops we do on every field. How many pounds of this and that's in the mix. We buy our seed early, can cut your cost in half if you're proactive at getting your seed priced in April, May, June, instead of waiting until, August, I want to go seed some cover crop. You're going to pay for it. You'll probably pay at least 30 to 50% more. And sometimes more than that, you won't even be able to find the seed that you want. So we plan for that as a crop. And when we plan for it as a crop, we think of those uses. Is it going to be grazed or not grazed? Is it going to get manure or not get manure? And we think of it all the way through. It was mentioned in the very beginning there, tiles monitoring has shown that, cover crops reduce it by 30 to 40%, your nitrate getting down there. And we're in a soil or a tile monitoring program with Iowa soybean, and that's exactly what ours shows. With a manure application field that perennially gets manure and cover crops, we've shown at least a 35-40% reduction. And when we went to no-till on top of that, we probably got closer to 50, just because I think our soil health improved that much more. And the cover crops and manure work. In our case, they work in corn on corn or corn on beans. We do it both ways. You will get, with that coulter I was talking about, the way we apply it, you get more soil disturbance in the bean stubble just because the corn stalks kind of cover it all up, but it works in both cases. It looks a little rough for a while, and then a few weeks later, it looks about the same. I think one of the bigger things is the manure. Like I started out, my little spiel here is, it needs to be part of the plan. It shouldn't be your only plan. Slides earlier showed other fertilizer applications going on there, but we got to think of when the crop is using nitrogen and ensure that we have it there through all those stages. Manure's maybe a little bit more forgiving than, say, anhydrous ammonia or 32% at getting it to those other stages, but weather events can still take nitrogen out of the manure right down the stream, just like it can the commercial fertilizer. So don't think it's going to solve the problem. Cover crops mixed in with it makes that a little bit easier, but it also changes a few things in that you got to put some nitrogen out there early. If you got a lot of it tied up in the cover crop and you're corn on corn, you might need to put a planter application or just prior to planter application of nitrogen on to get that crop to the point where the cover crop's releasing some of its nitrogen, or your roots have access to the manure nitrogen. But think it through. Don't just use manure as a fertilizer. Use it part of a program of fertilizer.
Yeah, one of the reasons that I hear producers who are hesitant to try a cover crop is that they're very concerned about terminating it in the spring and what effect it's going to have on their ability to plant in a timely manner. I wonder if you guys would be willing to share some of your thoughts on when to terminate and how to handle that.
I have never had a problem with terminating a cover crop as far as getting it to die. Again, you can't just go do it. You have to think about when you're doing it, how you're doing it, temperatures, weather, watch it. We routinely use glyphosate to terminate it. We always watch the weather. We want to be above 50 degrees minimum, not see a dip below that for the next 2 days if we can help it. Not had a problem. Corn on corn, early on in my experience with cover crops, we saw a yield reduction because we were letting the rye get pretty good size and not putting that nitrogen source out there with the planter. After we started putting a nitrogen source out there with the planter, we haven't seen a reduction with a lot of top growth out of the rye when we terminate it. I used to say I'd always terminate it 2 weeks prior to planting. After we got some nitrogen on the planter, I'll go right up to planting to terminate it. As far as getting into the field, you hear guys talk about that, but actually the cover crop makes it a whole lot easier to get into the field. Your planter runs cleaner, the soil carries the equipment better. When it's wet, if I have a cover crop, I can always plant those fields first. The more growth, the better as far as getting across the field. Because the residue helps carry it, but it's not the residue. It's really the soil structure below it that cover crop has helped to get the moisture away and still carry the equipment. So I haven't had that problem. Soybeans are really forgiving that way. Corn, you just got to watch it a little bit more, but I have not had an issue as long as we have the nitrogen out there and pretty much terminated up until planting. Soybeans, we're going to terminating our cover crop after planting instead of before. Just wait. Beans are going to handle it just fine. Probably benefit from it a little bit from what I've seen. And weed control.
Yeah, well said. I mean, I agree with every bit of that. The only thing, I reemphasize is that plantability is so much easier in green rye. You can make your strips easier. The planter just seems to run better in the green rye. We kind of got forced into it, many years ago. We would terminate our rye, 1st of April, and then wait 3 weeks to plant corn. Well, now it seems like we're planting corn just as early as we can plant corn. Guys are starting the 20th, the 15th, the 10th, and maybe even sooner than that. And, we don't have that 2 week window. That 2 week window was kind of made up, I think, by the universities or somebody, I don't know. But we were just, when it's time to plant corn, it's time to plant corn. I mean, if you can be out there doing anything else in the spring, you just will be planting corn because it's important to get that job done. I think that the biggest thing, is more nitrogen management than it is, termination of rye, but that'd be another subject.
Yeah, that's one thing I made a point of when we started this whole, my dad thought we were crazy when we started doing all this cover crop stuff. But I made a point to say that we are never going to do something here that's going to reduce yields. We're going to save soil, but we're not going to do anything that's going to reduce yields because we can't. From a profitability and longevity standpoint, we cannot reduce yields. So we have found ways not to wait that 2 week time frame from spraying to planting and got us beyond that. Because, like you said, if the weather's bad and you can't spray until April 20th, 2 weeks after that's too late to be planting corn, ideally. So we're not going to do that anymore. We found ways around that.
As far as planting, I think one thing we're going to change with the research we're seeing to raise soybean yields is just to plant early. That's the low-hanging fruit, and I could see us, start a week after Easter this spring. We'll be planting beans maybe first ahead of corn. We used to plant, soybeans into really tall rye because we'd be in the middle of May, maybe planting beans. Well, we're going to move that up, and maybe that rye won't be as tall when we're planting beans now. But it's a data planning thing for yields, and like Mark said, we we can't give up yield. When you got a commodity, you got to make your money with the yields. Those are the most profitable farms.
And one other thing on the planting side, something that's I think made us do a better job at it is not to be selling one group's piece of equipment, but precision planting. The more information I can have in the tractor when I'm planting, you've learned how to manage that situation of if you do terminate the rye and you go out there 2 weeks later, the ground is pretty hard. I mean, it tends to be drier on top and it's firm, and that planter wants to bounce around a lot. And the precision planting tells me that I need to slow down. And that's also where we've seen if you terminate 2 days before you go out and plant, the planter rides a lot smoother. But the precision planting stuff's told me that also, to validate what I thought was happening.
And then you mentioned you use some oat cover crop, and that should self-terminate for you in the spring, right? So, I mean, that's an entry point if you're worried about spring kill.
Yep. I think your personal opinion is oats from a true cover crop and nitrogen management's maybe halfway there compared to rye. That's why we always have, we started with some oats when we were afraid of some of those things. But now if we use oats, we still put rye in there because I don't want to give up that spring growth from a soil health standpoint. I may not need it from a residue and a cow management thing that I was doing the oats for, but I still want that rye in there to give me all the soil health benefits going forward, and nitrogen management's even better.
And then one of those early slides you showed how long it takes to gain 1% organic matter. I missed it. How long was it?
It depends on manure type, but if you're using a solid manure, it's something like 20 years. If you're using a liquid manure, it's probably in the neighborhood of 80 years, right? But that's manure alone, not manure with a cover crop. So if we really want to increase soil carbon levels, getting more organic matter is good for us, right? And part of that is growing a cover crop to feed the soils. But it takes a long time to change organic matter. I mean, when you look at Rob's slides of what our organic matter content is now, right, the prairie started with 6%, and we farmed for 200 years, and we got it down to 300%. Building it back, it's a long-term trend like that, right? It's not a quick overnight thing. If your soil starts a long way from wherever you're moving to, right, if you move from a heavy tillage management system to a minimum till or a no-till cover crop and manure, that number can happen a little quicker. But it's a long time, 20 years. I have a question for both of you. I think one of the struggles with cover crops is that jumping off point, right? We all need an inspiration to really say we want to do better, we want to change. What was sort of the driving factor for both of you? And I think maybe yours was, it's visible down in southeastern Iowa. So you can talk a little bit about that for me?
The one thing I do know, I mean, is just visibly you don't have the erosion. I mean, you can go out there and plant rye. Even a beginning farmer plants rye one time, they'll comment the first year, you just don't get the erosion from those heavy downpours. And we started to notice that a few years ago, and we started to get those heavier 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 inch rains all at once. We were holding things together pretty good, and that's because of the many years of rye cover crops in the roots and the interaction biologically, which I can't explain, but it made it more stable. It just made it, the infiltration rates went up, higher. But the one thing, like you said, Dan, it's you just don't see the sedimentation loss, and we've reduced that. And maybe we shouldn't be growing. Maybe we should have cattle on those hills. In pasture, where in a corn bean rotation, we've got some beans on some pretty steep slopes, and maybe where we shouldn't have. And that's where the rye cover crop really helps.
For me, it was going, cost sharing's part of it. It really helps you get started because you're just uncomfortable spending more money not knowing what you're going to get out of it. So cost sharing helped. For us, the biggest initial benefit was grazing. I mean, for somebody that has cows and can utilize the residue as well as get all these other soil benefits we're talking about, it's really a no-brainer. We did a project with Practical Farmers of Iowa trying to quantify what is that dollar benefit to us, and it's variable from year to year. That year you don't get a lot of fall growth, it's not near as good as the year you get great fall growth and great spring growth. We've almost always covered our seed cost when we graze to making 75, 80 bucks an acre from the grazing, the benefit we get out of that and not feeding. That's on top of all the soil benefits you get. So the thing that really got us started was that dollar benefit, seeing it from a grazing side. Well, then we started seeing, the soil health benefits and less erosion and all that. We do all 4,500 acres we do gets cover crop on it. And, I told you earlier the number they got manure on top of that. But after we started seeing the benefits of the soil health, the erosion, we got to the point where we learned how to stabilize or increase our crop yields instead of hurting them with cover crops. We do it on everything. Every acre going to corn or every acre going to beans gets a cover crop now. So it probably started with cost sharing, then the grazing benefits, and then seeing the other benefits. It's hard to spend all that money in the fall again for something that, it's like we treat it like a crop, and it's planting another crop. In our case, we'll buy 3 semi-loads of rye. We grow some of our own rye ourselves. It's another seed bill to pay, but we've seen the benefits from that. And we continually try to validate those benefits by like the project we did with Practical Farmers to quantify the dollars we were getting out of grazing. My latest one has been trying to measure soil health, and there's a few tests out there that measure soil health, and you can argue they're good or bad. We still got a lot to learn about them. But the one thing that struck out of me, the year I did my base soil health sampling, we farm everything from, we're in the Raccoon River bottom, and we got some sandy, gravelly soils to, nice Clarion Nicolette Websters that, maybe have an 88 CSR. But the field I talked about earlier that had been cover crop ever since my dad can remember, because that's where we always calved the cows, and literally what we thought was abusing it every spring because they ate everything off, and it was almost brown because we ate the cover crop growth off. But when we did our base soil health test, that field has a CSR of 55. It had our highest soil health score, and we did the Haney test, but it had literally by double of any of our other fields that were 83, 85, 88 CSR. It had the highest soil health score out of all of them. And I'm like, why was that? The first time I got it back, this test has to be wrong. So we went out and resampled it. It's like, it's such an outlier, there's something wrong with this test. Came back, very similar level, and it's just because there was more biological activity in that soil.
I would echo what Mark said. I think one of the biggest success stories, with making money with cereal rye is the feed value of the cattle. And in the spring we have a lot of green rolling hills with rye, and we're the envy of all the cattle farmers in the neighborhood. They just smile and look at that, the feed value. And I travel around a lot, talk to a lot of farmers, and what he just said, you hear that over and over and over. And that's one of probably the first really true success stories, in getting a return is, in the feed value for a ruminant. And then the next thing is, as long as we've stuck with it, there's no question of the benefits of the, the biology of the soil. I don't know if I can, quantify it, but other than the high infiltration rates and the loss of sedimentation, we can get out there and farm so much quicker, by days, and if I was a very large integrator, a very large farmer, to me, that would be enough, incentive to start growing rye just so you could get over more acres quicker. That I would do that in a minute. If you want to cover big acres quick, that's the way to do it.
And it's not just planting, it's the combine also. Just stays on top better in those fields that have that better soil health.
2 inches of rain, we can be back in the field harvesting the next day, probably a day and a half. We've got pictures to prove that. So.
All right, and with that, I think we've about used up our time allotment.